This is the Continuity Workshop, and my name is Dan Taranto. I'm a former president of the State Association and have been a trainer of grand jurors for 10 years. And so I've had a bit of exposure from jurors from all around the state, and continuity kind of comes of the notion that grand jury needs to look after itself. 1 year is not a very long time. And in 1 year, you have to start flat-footed as a group of 19 people, typically, few exceptions, and develop some processes of organization and protocol, and decide what you're going to undertake as a grand jury, embark upon those various investigations and activities, and assemble your reports and all that sort of stuff, and come up with something hopefully irrefutably credible at the end of 1 year, starting off as total non-expert people. This is one of the biggest problems with the grand jury system, is that the credibility of your reports are very commonly criticized on the grounds that you're a bunch of amateurs, you really don't know what you're doing, you have no experience or necessary training in the kinds of activities that you're undertaking, and therefore all the more reason that you have to kind of, what do you say, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of transcend this criticism by proving them wrong and coming out with impeccable reports with lists of findings that are absolutely irrefutable and recommendations that are very doable, practical, reasonable, and compelling. Not pie in the sky, not recommendations that aren't so doable or are ridiculous and easy to criticize. And so one of the elements of trying to provide you the necessary time to become reasonably competent in your very short tenure is to try to save you the time of reinventing numerous wheels, such as having to redevelop all of your letters of correspondence. There's so many letters that the grand jury can issue in recognition of complaints or in requests for information, and to draft all of these kinds of communications up from scratch each year by the jury burns up precious time of your talented individuals, and you should have a file of standardized letters for communication. Your report process should be a pretty standardized format. You should review past grand jury reports. Hopefully it'll have a certain uniformity and consistency in presentation, because if the grand jury keeps changing the way it does its reports each year, and this happens because grand jurors, they don't know. I mean, you guys, 19 strangers, you've never met before, you haven't worked together before, you're not necessarily trained in investigation, inquiry, doing research, don't necessarily have any reason to know what the difference between a fact and an opinion is. And if you write up a report that's just sort of based off the cuff attitudes that you have about government that you brought to the grand jury, you're going to be eminently criticized for your amateurish work. And so a grand jury should prepare a very standardized way of doing business, and that's what I call continuity. And grand jury generally has to put together this kind of program for itself. Nobody cares about the credibility of the grand jury more than the grand jurors themselves. The various officials are quite delighted if you provide them with many things in your report to criticize, to show how incompetent and unknowledgeable you are, and why what you have to say should not be regarded too seriously. And so the only way you can combat, or one of the primary ways you can combat that kind of thing, is by standardizing certain procedures and garnering your limited time so you can focus on the specific investigations that you choose to undertake and not be squandering your time reinventing wheels. And like, for instance, I would point to the example of reports. Some grand juries in their naivete do believe that writing the grand jury report is something like doing their high school yearbook. And they will purposely go out of their way to make their grand jury report look different than prior grand jury reports because they want to stand out as being distinctively separate and different. This is, I think, kind of a foolish thing, and it's done out of a lack of understanding of the bigger picture. And what I'm here to tell you is that with notions of continuity, your report should be very standardized. It should very typically be a very brief introduction introduction of the topic of investigation. It should be a very concise listing of the explicit findings of fact that you have generated during the course of your investigation. And I'll have to say at this point that those facts need to be absolutely irrefutable. That means those facts cannot be refuted by anybody. You have proof that your facts are correct, and that you have documentary evidence that your facts are correct, and that that your entire jury believes that your findings of fact are correct. If you have 7 people or 6 or 5 people in your grand jury that thinks your facts are incorrect, those particular facts should be set aside and reevaluated more carefully, because your facts should be so compelling that nobody disagrees with them, or nobody can prove them as being wrong. The only person that would have a motive to disagree with them would maybe be the department head of an agency that you're reporting on, that is making him maybe look as not so capable of a department head, and he'll defensively suggest that your facts are not correct. But if they're irrefutable, you will prevail. And so operational protocols basically speak to that. So if a grand jury embraces continuity, it should create a committee called the Continuity Committee, and people that are interested in this particular activity of providing continuity to their grand jury and dealing with these elements of continuity should serve on that committee. And the first duty of the Continuity Committee should be to monitor the report response process. The predominant role of the regular grand jury is to conduct civil oversight investigations into the operations of local government. As the result of that, you produce a report of findings and recommendations. Those findings and recommendations are then published. The Penal Code says that no later than 90 days after a grand jury submits a final report on the operations of any public agency subject to its reviewing authority, the governing body of the public agency shall comment to the presiding judge of the Superior Court on the findings and recommendations pertaining to matters under the control of the governing body. Or in other words, what that means is that within 90 days, every official subject to your report will talk about Department X. Your report is issued on Department X. You have found 100 findings of fact on Department X, and it's now published. Or the prior grand jury has done that. Now typically what happens is the grand jury issues its final report, and then they step down as a jury as the new grand jury is impaneled, because they use up every bit of their year to compile, prepare, develop and draft the reports, edit the reports, refine the reports, and then finally issue the report. And their year is up, they step down, they're no longer authorized with the grand jury powers, so no one will refute the fact that they are the grand jury that authored the report. The new grand jury, you guys, are in the position to monitor the response process. You might not be so capable to evaluate the content of the responses to the report, but you can monitor that the various officials have responded in accordance with the Penal Code with regard to those reports. For instance, the Penal Code, as a new law passed about 3 years ago, because many county officials were just disregarding the grand jury reports, and there was no, as a matter of fact, there were some counties that were commenting on grand jury reports with no comment. And the Attorney General came back with an opinion that said no comment constitutes a comment under the shall comment provisions of the law, which sounds like classic doublespeak, and I do believe it actually was. And so as a result of that, legislation was introduced, and the Penal Code now defines what a comment is. And this is what it says. With each finding, that means each finding, 100 findings, that means each of those 100 findings, the subject official shall comment in only 2 ways. He agrees with the finding, or he disagrees with the finding. There's only 2 choices. He can't say, maybe I agree, and maybe he's got to absolutely agree with it as being accurate, or he has to absolutely disagree with it as it being inaccurate. And if he disagrees with it, he has to explain why he disagrees with it, and then to provide the correct information. That's required on each finding. You can't take all the findings together and say, well, I looked over your 100 findings and some of them are not exactly right, but most of them are kind of close, and I really appreciate all your hard work, and I really will take every consideration of your recommendations in future years as new resources come available. Thank you very much. And basically say nothing about your report. And that used to be kind of a not an uncommon process. Now, yeah, they basically brush you off and without any specificity. Now they're required to agree or disagree. If they disagree, they have to explain why they disagree. With regard to the recommendations, and I'll point out that, well, let me return to findings of fact for one more brief thought. Again, irrefutable. And that means if you have 100 findings of fact, and you'll be surprised, some reports go that far, and you've got one fact that's wrong, one boner in the lot, that means you got 99 right and one wrong. Guess which one's going to be in the newspaper tomorrow? One is wrong. Exactly. And so you want to be absolutely certain that your facts are correct, because they'll go looking as hard as they can to find some mistake. If they can find a mistake, they can say, aha, they made a mistake. And if they can find a mistake and they can prove that it's a mistake, then that sort of suggests that there's other mistakes. When there isn't any, you know you got 99%. 99% is an A in most situations. But with a grand jury, 99% can be an F. And keep that in mind. It's very, very important. Your facts have to be irrefutable. And so if your field of 19 jurors, that's 19 people, 19 minds of working, hopefully 19 minds of thinking. And most grand jurors are in the 50 to 60 age bracket. So that means your typical grand jury has 1,000 years of life's experience under its belt. So under that 1,000 years of life's experience, you should have the collective wisdom to sift out the facts from the not-so-quite facts, or the maybe facts, or the facts that you wish were facts, but you can't prove it. You should be able to prove that they're facts. You should have documentary evidence to show that they're facts. You should have testimony on file that backs up your facts. And then further, there is a new provision in the law, and we used to recommend it regularly, but it was simply advisory in the workshop format. But now it's actually written in the penal code, and it says 933.05D on page 22 on the top, verification of findings. Once you have completed your work on your grand jury report, and you've conducted, all your investigation is completed, your committee work is completed, your report is drafted, you've gone before the full grand jury has accepted your report, there's a draft report. Now before it's issued to the public, what you need to do, or you don't need to do, it's up to you. You have the discretion under 933.05D. Clearly, you always have the discretion anyway. This doesn't even have to be here, but now it's stated so you can't confuse it. You can call in the official that's the responsible for of the agency that you're reporting on. You can bring them before the grand jury, and then once they're sat before the full grand jury, not a committee, but the full grand jury, your report is in draft form, and you want to finalize it. You then read to him. Don't provide him necessarily with a list, because if he got a list, he can go out and do other things. You're kind of pre-releasing your report before maybe even the judge has seen it. So read him your facts. Fact number one, your department has a budget of $500,000. Is that correct? He says, yes, that's correct. Check that fact off, it's correct. Now, your department employs 75 people. Is that correct? No, it's 77. We just hired 2 more. Oh, well, we better fix that one right now, because that's 77 to 75. They'll point that out. They didn't even know how many people we had. I mean, they make a quibble over something similar like that. It does happen, believe me. You want your facts to be impeccable. And so you go through your list of findings, and you get their response. If there's anything questionable, fix it now before it goes public. That's what you have. And then your final finding can be that these facts were verified by the department head on such and such a date as being correct. And so it's right there in your report, as of such a date. So that's the other thing. If something changes after your report is issued, you know, say tomorrow they hire 10 more people, or say tomorrow the budget gets increased, or something else changes. The new facts are different from the old facts. Your facts, it's important your facts be dated in that regard. So that section of facts, once verified by the department head, then that kind of, where you say, disarms him from coming out later and pointing out inaccuracies in your report, because it's right in there that he's already verified these findings, and he can't lie to the grand jury, or she. So if he said those facts are correct as of that date, and you have that, in your record, he will have perjured himself if he disagrees with his own comments at a later date. So it's a good practice to be extra sure your facts are absolutely irrefutable. Now, when it comes to recommendations, so I'm talking on both ends of it here. I'm talking about you preparing your report, and I'm also talking about you monitoring the responses to the prior grand jury's report, because their report's just like your report's going to be: findings, recommendations, different topics. And hopefully next year's grand jury will do for you what you're doing for them, and that's what the continuity part of the picture is. So a subject official has only 4 options on how he's going to respond to your grand jury report. Only 4 ways, not 5, 4. First one, Penal Code 933.05b spells it out in very clear language. The recommendation has been implemented, with a summary regarding the implementation action. Now, this happens very often, particularly in situations where a grand jury stumbles across something that's just conspicuously incorrect and it should be fixed. And the official knows it, known it for 5 years, but nobody's noticed it before, so has been able to slide on it. But now the grand jury came around and, one of them, hey, what about that? And so now the official's aware that the grand jury's aware there's no handrail in the handicap section of the welfare department. And there's already been 2 or 3 people tripped down the stairs this year, maybe even a lawsuit for $50,000, who knows? But you might come onto something like that. You come onto the missing handrail, or the handrail with splinters in it, for an example purpose. It could be much more onerous than that. Well, the official knows he better get that fixed quick, because that's instant trouble for him. It's so obvious that everyone's going to ask, why didn't you fix that 5 years ago? Why didn't you just, it's not a big deal. It costs a couple $100 to fix the handrail. Well, he'll fix that tomorrow. And so when the grand jury report comes out in 3 or 4 months, and the welfare department, the handicapped staircase needs a handrail, the official can then take comfort. Well, I don't know what the grand jury's talking about here, Judge. We fixed that thing a long time ago. They must have got some old information somewhere. Makes it look like the grand jury's the bozo and not him, right? But you know in your heart that that handrail got fixed because you were on the scene, you saw it, he noticed that you saw it, and he fixed it because he saw that you noticed, and he knows he's going to have to count for it later. So he took care of it now to make it look like it's his idea. And you can laugh all the way back to the courthouse saying, it's your credit that that handrail was fixed. And a lot of grand jury effectiveness comes in this form. The officials will not give you the credit for your best ideas. They're going to take the credit. It can be all originated in the grand jury, but the grand jury precipitates action where action is needed, and it's been known that the action is needed, but by the fact that you just walked in the door and you noticed, maybe you didn't even notice, maybe you totally overlooked the handrail, but he thinks maybe you might have saw the handrail. He fixed the handrail, just in case you put it in your report.
You made it nervous.
Yeah, and so, just by being there, you affect improvement in government operations. Okay. So, and the next possible response is the recommendation has not yet been implemented, but it will be implemented in the future. And then they have to give a time frame for that implement. That means they recognize that your recommendation is a good one, and we want to do it as soon as we can find the funding, or get the staffing, or get better facilities, or whatever their needs are in order to accomplish it. They've recognized and acknowledged that your recommendation is on the money, and that yes, we're going to proceed, and maybe even the fact that it's in your report will help them get the funding to take care of the problem that you found. And so that's response possibility number 2. Number 3, and this will be used sometimes, is that, and sometimes the grand jury undertakes to investigate some fairly complicated issues. And you have to admit, particularly in the more metropolitan areas, government is incredibly complex and convoluted and has all kinds of twists and turns and angles and connections and interactions that aren't always so easy for the grand jury to grasp in one short year. And so grand juries might not really appreciate the complexity of the area in which they've, made some findings and recommendations. And the official says, well, we just can't come up with a good answer on this one right yet. We need a little more time to evaluate the recommendation, and it requires further analysis. Well, the law is very explicit here, and I'll read it to you. The recommendation requires further analysis with an explanation and the scope and parameters of the analysis or study. That means they have to tell you why they need more time, what they're going to do at that time, and then a time frame in which they will make their final discussion and report on that particular recommendation. But in no case do they have more than an additional 90 days. They're limited to 90 days for the first response. If they opt for option 3, further analysis, that means they get 3 more months, not 4 more months, not a year, 3 months. If it goes to 3 months and 1 day, they're in violation of the law. Grand jury is supposed to monitor government departments that are not complying with the law, and you should be red flag up, judge, they're overdue. You can either go to the judge or request that the judge issue a letter because really the responses technically go to the judge. The judge receives them, turns them over to the county clerk. Once they go to the county clerk, they become the public record. So when the judge receives them, if you get the letter from the judge saying your further analysis time has lapsed, your responses are due now, I want to see them by Friday. If the officials fail, and there's no reason why the judge shouldn't do that for you if everything is correct and with regards, it's the law. If he fails to produce the responses by the deadline, he's in contempt of court, and the judge can exercise certain sanctions, fine, jail time, whatever's appropriate, admonishment. But the point is that the officials have to know that the grand jury, current grand jury, is going to be covering for the former grand jury, and that the future grand jury is going to cover for your grand jury on these kinds of matters. And once you get the protocol of continuity of that sort rolling in your county, you basically condition your officials to be mindful to their responsibilities in responding to grand jury reports, and problems will become less and less in this regard. Yes?
Yeah, on her point there a second, if it says may, then we have our choice.
Then it's discretionary.
If it says shall, we have to do it.
Must. Yes. Okay, filing reports, grand jury reports and responses of the county clerk. Now the state law says that whenever a grand jury report is published, that the county clerk shall maintain a copy of that grand jury report in perpetuity. That means forever. That means in most counties in this state, you should be able to go down to the county clerk and see 150 copies of grand jury reports nice and neatly filed on a shelf. I'll tell you, there's not very many counties that can do that. Do you know how many reports you can find in your county, is the question. And so one of the things I suggest the grand jury do is go down and visit the county clerk's office and ask to see their collection of grand jury reports. And if they say, oh yeah, come on down, it's right over here in room number B, we've got them all lined up real easy, good condition, or he might say, oh really, you sure you're in the right department? I thought the judge did that. Oh, I don't know. I'll have to check, but I don't think so. I think you got wrong information. Now you know that something's wrong in the county clerk's office, because it says right here, 1 copy of each final report, together with responses thereto, found to be in compliance with this title, shall be placed on file with the county clerk. And then it says in another place, in perpetuity. And so the county clerk is the one that's responsible to have those reports, and they should be there. Now, that's true. There may be some copies in the grand jury office. There may be some copies in the Superior Court office. There may be some copies in the government room of the county. There might be some copies in other places. But the county clerk has the statutory responsibility to keep a file of all grand jury reports in the history of that county. What's new about this is that just last year, a new law has passed because the finding has been that many of these county clerks are derelict in their responsibilities, have not been keeping these documents as they're supposed to, partly because they don't know, and partly because who knows why. But they should know, and they should be, and if they don't have that file, they should be doing everything they can to reconstruct that file and find past reports from whatever source they can, because there's other people that keep grand jury reports. Historical Society, the government room in the local county library might have some. You know, the county clerk should be responsible for that file, and if he hasn't been keeping it up, he should certainly be keeping it up henceforth. And now there's the requirement that the county clerk has an additional responsibility. Not only does he keep his own file of grand jury reports and responses, but he is required to prepare an official copy of the grand jury report and the official responses to that grand jury report and file them with the state archivist. Because we got the authority last year that now the state archives are going to be a centralized repository for copies of all the grand jury reports in the state of California as of last year forward. Now they will backfill to the extent that they receive those copies, but so now you'll have two sources: your local grand jury report archive in the county clerk's office, plus a state archive of all grand jury reports from 1998 forward will now be, plus the responses will be located in the state archives. And the great advantage of this is not only does it provide a backup for the grand jury report archive in your county, henceforward, so that if you get some slouches for county clerks in the future and other reports are lost, well, maybe the same ones won't send them to the archivist either. So here again is the issue with the continuity committee of the grand jury, is to check every year to make sure that copy is sent into the state archivist and that the county clerk has placed in their collection a copy of the current report, and that there is a file of neatly well-maintained copies of the grand jury report. And this is just a visit down to the county clerk. He can do it in a half hour after lunch someday, and this sends a message to the county clerk that the grand jury is going to start checking on this. I better start doing it. Or I better get that box of grand jury reports over at the warehouse out where I can show them to the grand jury, because they're going to come in every year and want to see them. And if he says, oh, well, geez, those grand jury reports, I think they're out in warehouse B. It's about 5 miles on the other side of Dodge. It'd take us at least a couple of weeks to get them here. He can just say, well, we want to see them now. Let's go. And, you know, you don't get brushed off with some, you know, unacceptable response like that. You go out to warehouse B and see if they're really there. You hopefully won't find them in a puddle down in the basement, all mildewed over. Or something of that sort. But I think by just making that regular visit to the county clerk's office as a matter of annual course, make sure that the archivist has received his at state, Sacramento state archivist, and that your file is a good file and it's a developing file, because that's a very important file of documents. It is the only artifact of all the grand juries that have ever walked the earth in your county. And somebody comes around 50 years from now and says, hey, I want to see the grand jury report from the year 1999 to 2000. You know, the millennial report. I want to see that copy. Oh, sorry, we ain't got it. You know, there's your history of your year of service. Gone. You want to make sure the county clerk's doing his duty. And if you make that regular visit, he'll start doing it if he hasn't been, or he will proudly show you how he has been doing it, and you can pat him on the back for it. So, that's something the continuity committee can do. And these are all activities. They're warm-up activities. You're only around for a year, but the first few months, you don't want to go jumping into big investigatory things. You want to kind of start feeling out your group, get familiar with one another. You want to kind of consider what the possibilities are. You don't want to make decisions on what you're going to investigate right away, because you're not really fully familiar with all the possibilities of what you can investigate. And you don't have to investigate everything. And you can't investigate everything. It's too much. And so you want to pick and choose. You want to carefully select what you want to investigate. You want to select things that are important, meaningful, worthwhile, not innocuous, superfluous, not so important. And some grand juries, they'll write about all kinds of stuff. Yeah, so-and-so's office has peeling paint. They should paint the office. Ho-hum. You know, and I'm telling you, there are reports like that. I mean, why squander your time on something so frivolous as that? Sift about, ask, you interview people. You know, you can interview folks in the community. You can call in anybody you want and say, this is our year of service. We're not sure what we should undertake. You can call in the supervisors. You can call in the city manager. You say, what do you think we should study? We're trying to determine, you know, topics for investigation this year. Ask for some suggestions and think about it. You know, talk amongst yourselves. Take a couple of months before you dive in. Because, you know, some grand juries, they get up to here and stuff in the first few weeks, and they're all bogged down with all this stuff to do, and then a couple of real juicy projects come along and, oh, gosh, we should have done that, but no, you can't. You're all committed to this over here. So think about it, because you can only do so much. Pick and choose carefully. What do you think would be of greatest value and benefit to your community of the choices that you have? And on that basis, select. Where can you have the biggest impact to help improve your community, help groom and sophisticate and polish local governmental process? And that's what you do. You have the full authority to determine what you're going to investigate. Totally is up to your grand jury. And then I would also add that you shouldn't select a topic based on the bare minimum vote. Because what the Penal Code says, Penal Code 916, I'll read it to you if I can find it quickly. There we go. Penal Code 916 says, and this is one of the key provisions in the Penal Code with regards to the grand jury's authority to independently determine what it's going to do. Rules of proceeding and concurrence. Each grand jury shall, and I'll skip some of this stuff, you can read it for yourself, adopt its rules of procedure in all public actions of the grand jury. That means everything you decide to do, and it says whether concerning criminal or civil matters, including the adoption of final reports, shall only occur with the concurrence of that number of grand jurors necessary to find an indictment pursuant to Section 940. Now what that means is that the grand jury requires a 2/3 vote, basically. If you're in a 19-member county, which is the great majority, it means you got to have 12 votes. So here you are looking at the list. You got them on the chalkboard. Okay, we've taken in the 6 weeks now to consider possible topics for investigation. In the meantime, the continuity committee's working on following up on the responses to last year's report. You're checking with the county clerk to see if they got the file. You're kind of getting familiar with the terrain. You're letting the county know that you're out there walking the halls, and but you haven't decided yet what you're going to study. And you're getting complaints. Give a little slack so some complaints can pour in, you know. You don't just charge off at the first 5 complaints. You give it a few more weeks, you might have 50 complaints. And so here you are all caught up doing the first 5 up to here, and here comes 50 more. You can't do those because you're too busy doing these. So you get it listed out. And you might want to deal with things where you get like 10 complaints about the same subject. If you only get 1 complaint, maybe this is the only time this ever happened and you don't know. So you don't want to go charging off too fast on anything. That's my suggestion. Of course, you can do anything you want because, like I said, grand juries are perfectly authorized to do goofy things, and they do. And so you can get out and get yourself caught up in things and maybe not have such an impact as you might have otherwise. But you get your list of possible candidate topics up on the board, and you're taking a ballot of your membership on what you should and shouldn't undertake. And so topic number 1, you get, and it's a real hot one. Some people think, yeah, we ought to do that. We got to go investigate that planning department. It's the one that a lot of them like to, because everybody hates the planning department, right? And so, for example, but you can only get 12 jurors to say, yeah, let's do the planning department investigation. 7 of them say, no, let's not do the planning department investigation. Well, you got the 12 votes. That means you could do it. But you got to realize, if you only got that bare minimum 12 votes, all those 7 people that disagree with you have to do is persuade 1 of the 12 to change their mind. And after a year of work, they can say, you can't release the report. And so you're much better off going with areas where you have a unanimous support of that investigation. So you don't have to face that. And one of the other things too, if you do things by the simple 12-vote requirement, it tends to contribute to the factionalization of the grand jury. And when you get a grand jury factionalizing within itself, you got bad chemistry. And that means, well, you didn't give me that, so I ain't going to give you this. And then off it goes. And then you get grand juries doing bozo stuff like happened up in County this year. I don't know if you heard about it, but grand jury, there was 5 grand jurors that dissented and didn't like what the rest of them had decided, so they went public. And they made a big brouhaha up there, and the court finally threw the whole grand jury out because they were just totally out of control. And then you got to the crux of it. I had calls from those, we want to do this, and those guys, I got calls from both sides. It was very amusing. And each one pointing fingers at the other, and both of them thinking that they're right, and the judge finally threw up his hands, kicked them all off. The problem is that none of them had received any training, and so they didn't know what they were doing, and they assumed things that weren't true, and they didn't know that confidentiality meant they had to keep their mouth shut. It's lucky the judge didn't fine them and put them in jail, because he could have. But that's the sort of thing you want to avoid. So I would strongly recommend that you proceed on investigations that have a plurality of support in the grand jury. There's hundreds of things that you can investigate. Why pick the ones that are just controversial within your own group? Go with stuff that you have strong support for, and you're going to end up with a much more rewarding experience, I suspect. Okay, and now where are we? We're down to, okay, the 45 days. Okay, so now your grand jury has issued its report. Last year's grand jury has issued its report. There is another provision in the law that was passed about 3 years ago that says for 45 days after the end of a term, the foreperson and his or her designees shall, upon reasonable notice, be available to clarify the recommendations of the grand jury report. And here's the way I like to interpret that in a grand jury friendly way, is that the foreperson and his or her designee. So as the foreperson, I designate the whole grand jury. That means all of you should be available to follow the response process to your report. You're not the grand jury. You don't have the grand jury power of subpoena, calling in witnesses, or going to the court and compelling officials to comply with the provisions of the response statutes. But in your current grand jury, you guys, even though you don't know anything about last year's grand jury report, you weren't there, you did not witness the testimony, you did not review the evidence, but you can follow the law to see to it that the officials have responded in accordance with the law to each finding, in accordance with agree or disagree with an explanation. You don't have to know about the content of the report to determine if they've done that or not, and they've done it within the time frame provided, 90 days or 60 days as appropriate, and you certainly should read that as your continuity committee. It's the former grand jury that can evaluate content. And I think you're no longer the grand jury. Now you've done your year of service. You are last year's grand jury. Your report's issued. You're now off the jury. You have no subpoena power. You have no power of any sort anymore. No one's going to quibble with the fact that you're the authors of the report that's at hand, but you don't have any legitimate authority other than that now you are full-fledged citizens of a free society like you always were, that have this grand jury experience. You don't have the power, but you can follow this response process through, because the responding parties are the governing bodies. Governing bodies under the Brown Act can make no decisions without it being public and on the published agenda. And so when the time comes for the governing body, that's the Board of Supervisors, the City Council, the Board of Directors of the Service District, etc., they have to put it on the agenda. Next Tuesday at 2 o'clock we will be handling the matters of the response to the grand jury report from last year. You know, it'll be right there. So it's announced. I suggest that the authors of that report, the full grand jury, as many as possible, should be in attendance at that board meeting. And the full grand jury, the current year's grand jury, should be there too. And if you're all there, they're going to do as tight and neat and appropriate a job as they can, because you're going to have all 40 of you watching them. And you don't necessarily have to say anything, but say a question comes up and there's a recommendation in there, and you were as careful as you could be in writing the recommendation, but you realize now that, well, yeah, there's two ways to read that recommendation. It could mean we're supposed to do this, or it could mean we're supposed to be that. We're not really sure what the grand jury meant. Now you're there, you can tell them what you meant. And then they can know, and then they can react to it with greater accuracy. And then the current grand jury can watch the process to see that the process unfolds in accordance with the penal code, and they can also realize that this is what's going to happen with their grand jury report when they're done, and be alerted to the fact that it's wise for them to follow the response to their report too. And there's nothing keeping you as a free citizen at this point standing up and speaking to something in the report if your local governing body protocols permit it. There's a lot of variation in that, but you can certainly be there to witness it, and you can certainly provide testimony if the opportunity is afforded. I know in the county that I'm in, we adopted an ordinance prior to the adoption of this statute by the state that does provide for a public forum for not only the former jurors to speak, but for the members of the general public that have read the grand jury report can get up and say, well, we really like the grand jury report, but they failed to look into this one thing, and we'd like to say, you know, and add something to it. Because here now you have the governing body, and the reason the governing body is supposed to respond to the grand jury report is because they're the ones that have the power to do something. If there's something you want them to implement, they're the ones in the position to budget for it, or instruct their department head that we want this taken care of next year, and then it'll get taken care of. So if you are persuasive in your report before the governing body, and you're there, all them eyeballs are watching them, when this comes before them, they can't just sort of consent agenda, rubber stamp it through inadequately addressed. So you take that back with you and discuss it with your other jurors, and you'll, I think, hopefully come to that same conclusion. There is life after the grand jury, and you should certainly follow through your baby, the report that you prepared so carefully and worked so hard on all year. You shouldn't just think the judge is going to take care of it for you. He won't. Or the DA or the county council, he won't. They're busy people. They got other things to do. You're the ones that wrote the report. You're the ones that understand the report. You're the ones that should be there to witness how it's responded to. And the current grand jury is there with the power to enforce any abuse of the specific responsibilities to the court with regards to responses. Okay, so everyone has a handbook. Do you all know who wrote your handbook?
You mean a handbook that tells you how to do everything?
Yeah, your woodchuck manual for grand jury service.
No, we don't have one.
Okay, well that's one of the reasons why the State Association several years ago, when it was our finding that about 50% of the counties had no handbook, undertook the project, a 2-year study of handbooks from around the state that was then reduced with some other elements that were deemed appropriate, produced the generic syllabus, basically designed to give something to these juries that had no handbook, but is a good document to have as well in your county, because one of the other findings is there's no two handbooks the same. Some handbooks were last updated 20 years ago. Some of these handbooks were written by district attorneys, others by county councils, some by grand juries, some by some committee of the bunch. Some of them were borrowed from a neighboring county, and your county's name erased out and your county put in. So there's a lot of variations on where these handbooks have come from, and one of the elements of continuity is take a look at your handbook and consider, is it updated to current statutes? Is it comprehensive? How does it look, and how does it stack up with the handbooks in your neighboring counties? You can write a letter to your neighboring county saying, hey, here's a copy of our handbook, would you please send us a copy of yours, and do a little handbook swap. I think the strength of a grand jury is enhanced by having in their grand jury library, you all have grand jury libraries, right? Mm-hmm. Private libraries dedicated to the grand jury? For your exclusive use?
I live in Rome where there are some books.
Well, okay, well, I'm telling you, you better have one. I think it's a good thing, and if you don't, you got to give it some thought. A place to put your collection of handbooks, because you don't know where the information is that you want. Your handbook might be quite good, and it might have an area on form letters that is, all right. But if you look at the neighboring county's handbook on form letters, you might find, geez, they got a whole bunch more, and they're a lot better than ours. And so you can use theirs, or improve yours to kind of learn from what some of your neighboring juries have managed to generate. And they can likewise learn from yours, because all books have their strong and weak points, and you don't know which of those handbooks is going to be the most informative. And so I recommend that you have a collection of handbooks, and that be one of the things for your grand jury library is where is your, not your grand jury handbook, but where is your handbook collection? Because you want to look and cross-reference, and you want to get the very best idea of the ideas available on how to proceed with something that you're curious about. Now, along that line, I'd like to say, here's a little quiz for you. Which handbook has the most information?
The syllabus. The syllabus.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I really don't know. This one weighs about 3 times as much. But we just talked about accusation. In the syllabus, you'll find, and it's very well indexed and cross-referenced, you'll find that there's 3 pages of treatment of the accusation power of the grand jury. It goes into a discussion of the differences between nonfeasance, misfeasance, malfeasance. It cites the statutes that are relevant to the accusation power. It describes what the procedure is to file an accusation, and basically most of what you need, if not all of what you need, is right here. Though I would urge you, as I would urge you in all cases, don't take my word for it. Check the syllabus, and then check every other handbook you can get your hands on, and see that you have as much information as possible before you actually undertake to issue an accusation, because it is a very serious, grave matter. You just don't want to be doing it half-cocked or ill-informed. But by comparison to the syllabus with 3 pages of information, here's a handbook prepared by a county council that is not bad. Actually, there's a lot of good things in this handbook that I think are better than what's in the syllabus. But when we look up accusation, what do we find? Here's what's on accusation. These little tiny 4 lines at the bottom of the page. And this is what it says. The grand jury may be asked to hear evidence as to whether a local official committed willful or corrupt misconduct in office, and determine whether to present formal accusations requesting the official's removal from office pursuant to Government Code 3060. If such a request is made, the grand jury will be given specific instructions in regards to the procedures, period. That's all it says. Now, how much do you know about accusation from that? You know nothing. And who has the control? And grand juries often, with handbooks of this sort, have no idea of their accusation authority. And that's why it's important to have more than one handbook, to know who wrote your handbook, because every bailiwick will bias the handbook in a different way. A district attorney's handbook will be predominantly prosecutorial stuff, how to do a grand jury indictment, with very little on civil oversight, generally, because the district attorney is not interested in civil oversight. There's no convictions to be had in civil oversight, and the DAs want convictions so that they can get reelected. Now, the county councils, on the other hand, are not going to have very much on criminal indictments, because their bailiwick is more the civil oversight side. But then they have to be tempered with the fact that they have the dual role of protecting local governmental officials in the county from legal actions or embarrassing situations or other kinds of awkward publicity, and yet they have to advise the grand jury. So that's how you find in a county council prepared handbook very little information about the accusation power, because they don't necessarily want you to go running off accusing local officials, because then that means that the county council is going to be burdened with a lot of work to try to see if he can take care of that problem. So, but again, not to say that there isn't valuable stuff in here. The best of all worlds is to have a collection of handbooks, have one hopefully that you have as your own grand jury's handbook that's updated as well as possible, but at the same time keep that file of other counties' handbooks. Always be on the outlook for handbooks from other sources so that you can have as comprehensive a file as possible. You never know where you're going to get the best treatment They may all treat the same stuff, but the narrative in this book might be better than the narrative in that book. This one might be much more easy to understand in certain respects and more difficult to understand in others. And so by going back and forth to different documents, you can really start to develop a more fully dimensional view of what your true power and authority and options are. Yes?
On updating handbook, if the penal code changes periodically in regard to what...
Every year.
So how do we as a grand jury make sure that our handbook is updated as far as the penal code?
Well, one of the things you need to know, and that's why it's an element of continuity, I think every grand jury as a part of its initial proceeding through its continuity undertaking should look at the handbook. There should be a date in there. There should be some indication as to who it was that prepared this. Was this prepared by the county council in collaboration with the grand jury? Is this a borrowed handbook from some other county that was just sort of, pleasurized just to have something rather than nothing? And it might have some elements in it that are totally absurd in your county. You might have a metropolitan county handbook in a rural county, and it wouldn't be similarly applicable in some regards. So you need to be discerning. You should not... The handbook is not a law book, as was described by Dr. Myers this morning. It's something that's put together by an individual or a committee of individuals doing their best dead reckoning on things. And so it is not the final word, and you should, if there is anything in the handbook that troubles you, if there is any slight red flag on, that doesn't sound right, you shouldn't assume that the handbook is the Bible and it's without flaw or error. And you should always check and cross-check and verify with your advisors anything that you suspect might not be correct or updated. And one of the first things you can do when you come into office is to ask the county council, what legislation, is there any new legislation on grand jury in the last couple of years? Yes, Les.
Dr. Meyer this morning pointed out the loose leaf part in the back of the penal code. That's updated constantly, and it will tell you 1999 is the effective date, so forth, so you can see the actual changes and they apply.
So we would get that from our county council.
It should be a part of the law library in your
And
county.
additionally, sometimes one grand jury, well-meaning, will take this county council handbook and say, ah, boy, look at this, look at that accusation section, that sucks. And then go and rewrite the whole handbook a la their way of looking at it. And they might leave out major sections from this one, or they might rewrite them in a way that they leave out some important material. 5 years later, some grand jury comes along and is looking something up, and they find something in this, or can't find something in this book that is in the older book. So you shouldn't throw away your old handbook, because very often treatment in the older handbook is much more understandable than the treatment in the new handbook. One of the problems with revising anything, sometimes people take a certain pride of authorship, and they feel like they've got to change things in order to feel like they did something. And often, like I saw one example where the handbook was revised in one county where they they had a compilation of the penal codes, and they wrote out the full penal code. And well, this grand jury thought, well, that took up too much space and made it too bulky. And so what they did is they abbreviated the penal code and left the numbers in, but they didn't put in the full paragraph or so of what the penal code said. So the person that reads it doesn't know that that's only part of the statement under that number instead of the entire statement. They thought they were making something easier, and maybe they were, but they were making it more inaccurate at the same time. And so I highly recommend that you never trust just a single source, that you always get two sources and confirm that what you're operating on is correct. And that's why it's a good idea to have multiple handbooks, including a file of all that. You should have a historical file of all the handbooks of your county. That'd be wonderful. It's just, if nothing else, for the historical significance of it. So that's it for handbooks. Now, we're going to talk about the grand jury library and the grand jury reports and responses. The library should have at least 10 years worth of grand jury reports in it with the responses. That's quite a bunch of documents, probably take up a couple of feet. Well, if it's time to undertake an investigation, you want to know if prior grand juries have covered that territory before. You want to become familiar with what the past grand juries have found out in investigating similar agencies. So our favorite Department X is up for investigation this year. You want to know how many times has Department X been investigated over the past 10 years by the grand jury. You don't want to get into the embarrassing situation that I've seen several grand juries, and it blows me away. I've seen grand juries that come out with a report on a study of Department X when the grand jury immediately before them did even a bigger study on Department X, and they don't even know it. And then when their report comes out, their report is lesser report or a similar report to the former grand jury's report, and the results are contradictory. That's a colossal embarrassment. The official gets before the judge and says, look, judge, what am I supposed to do? This year's grand jury issues this report. Next year's grand jury issues this report. They say totally opposite things and tell me to do opposite things. What am I supposed to do? They throw up their hands, and what happens? Both grand juries look like they're foolish, and the whole credibility of the entirety of the grand jury work for that year is totally, blemished. If you haven't taken the time to at least look at the prior 10 years of grand jury reports on topics that are concurrent and similar or identical to what you're currently considering undertaking, you're being very, very, amateurish, less than amateurish. You should look. You should find out what former grand jurors have said. But when you pick up that pile of documents, okay, now we got to wade through 10 grand jury reports every time we want to go do a study. That's a lot of work, and it is. And so what you need in the continuity context is you need to index your past grand jury reports. You need to get that file together, have it on the shelf, and then you need to take a time where each of you on, say, the continuity committee has 3 or 4 or 5 members. Each of you can take 3 or 4 of those grand jury reports, take them home over the weekend, and each one of you can take them and abstract them. And you say, so each grand jury report, you go through, you find out what the reports were, you identify the department, and then you make a brief statement of the general focus of that grand jury report. And then you compile your results, and you end up with an index. This index has 25 years of grand jury reports in it, as well as an index of all the contents of the grand jury library. And you can then say Department X. You look up Department X, and you see that, well, in the past 10 years, there have been 7 investigations of Department X. And of those 7 investigations, 3 of them are exactly the same thing you're considering doing this year. You should certainly pick up those 3 grand jury reports, and probably the other 4 too, and go and review through them and become familiar with the kinds of problems your predecessor juries have found and the kinds of recommendations that they made, and also the kinds of responses that were given to those reports. Were they constructive? Was progress being made? Are these problems chronic and unresolved, or is the problems becoming less and less, or are they becoming bigger and bigger? It's good to understand or appreciate what the trends are, and the only way you can get a feel for that is to review the works of your predecessors, just like you hope the future grand juries will include you in the review of their work. And by preparing an index, you make it very easy. If every grand juror has one of these, and you know you're heading that way, well, do we have anything else? You can just, like in a second, you can look it up. Oh, look, go over to the grand jury library, pick those out, divvy them up between you, go home, do some homework, come back and discuss, and already you know more about that department than you did last week, and you know more about that department than you will know if you study that department without that benefit for the next several months. You are way ahead of the game, which means that you are in a position to do a much more penetrating job than those former grand juries were, because you have the benefit of all their insights, hard work, findings, recommendations. And then when you finally get around to going down and knocking on the door or making the appointment with the department head to come and do a visit, you already have under your belt a fairly big appreciation of the generic kinds of problems that that department has suffered over the past 10 years, so you can start asking the kinds of questions that would reveal what progress has been made in those areas, or if no progress, or if the problem is actually getting worse. You'll have some sense of the trend. And you'll also have some sense of the disposition of the officials associated with that agency by the quality and the relevance of the kinds of responses that they've provided to those former reports. So you should absolutely, without fail, before you leave the grand jury room, research at least the last 10 years of former grand jury investigations on any department that you're considering undertaking in your year of service. And I might mention, along with the index, that the State Association has done an effort of indexing 5 years worth of grand jury reports statewide. And so you can see in a glance by flipping through the broad range of areas of investigation of counties throughout the state. Just by seeing through here, you might find that there's some other counties that are similar to yours that have investigated agencies similar to, or identical to the ones you're considering to investigate, and you might communicate with those juries to see if you can get copies of their reports. So that's the library, the grand jury reports and indexes. Directory to past grand jurors, another helpful tool. So say you come upon, or let me come to back to that a little bit later. I want to hop ahead to investigation frequency. A little chart that can be prepared, page 28, and then 2 more pages, is this little chart. And on the chart, you have 2 axes. You have years across the top, and all the various governmental agencies on it. This is just an abbreviated one. I recommend you make a big one that's up on the wall so you can list the 50 or 70 or 120 agencies that are relevant to your grand jury's investigation authority. And then across the top, put at least your 10 years, and if you're ambitious, 10 or 20, 50 years, however far back you can go, and have the motivation to do so. And then check off. You know, you just pick up your 1989 grand jury report and you say, well, they investigated the airport, the Board of Supervisors, the County Administrative Office, the community, on down. Each report you do that, and when you get done, you get this wonderful visual aid. Where's the grand jury been over the past 10 years in a glance? And so if you're interested in seeing, have there been any reports on Agency X in the last 10 years, you can, in a glance, say, no, not a one. Or you can say, oh, geez, they've been investigated 7 times out of the past 10 years. And you know that right now. You don't have to go and get the books off the shelf and page through each one individually. You can do it in a glance. And then you can know it's there, you know it's not there. Another thing it does for you is it tells you who hasn't had the benefit of a grand jury visit in 20 years. And you might use that as a criteria to select which departments you might choose to visit. It's not a bad idea in at least picking 1 or 2 of those departments, agencies, or entities that haven't had the benefit of a grand jury report in 20 years that you send a committee by to go check them out. Just to say, who are you guys? What do you do? What's going on? You know, it doesn't mean you're going to find anything necessarily wrong, but I think part of the function of the grand jury is to walk the halls and be a good roving patrol and to let the government world know that you're about, and not necessarily go back year after year after year studying the same departments over and over and over again. Get around. There's more departments than you got time to cover. You might as well give all of them a little piece of the action. Yes?
The grand jury system, I see they have the department investigated. They investigated themselves?
Yes. The grand jury can investigate itself, and it's one way to bring things to the fore. Like, for instance, if you have no office, if you have no word processor, if you have an insufficient budget, if you don't have a handbook, if you need a better training program, you can do a study of yourself and say, and they made these findings, we didn't have enough training, we don't have good enough facilities. You can do a survey of former grand jurors to find out what their attitudes were with regards to their experience, build up a little database, and publish a report based on those findings. Our recommendation is the court fund better training for the grand jurors, that an office space should be dedicated to the grand jury, and you get that stuff out into the public. When the public finds out that the grand jury has been hamstrung, believe me, it is effective. And like I say, once upon a time, I think it was over half of the counties in the state had no dedicated office. Now it's like only about 15%. And it's a result of grand juries doing self-study reports and getting that information out to the public. It's embarrassing to the courts. It's embarrassing to the supervisors when they're not being funded for training or when they don't have an adequate facility to conduct their work.
I would like to do that, but my PGA says you can't do that because you are an arm of the superior court and you can't, the law says you cannot.
Yeah, that's, go ahead, Les.
The easy answer is that you may not investigate the administrative function of the court itself, but you may investigate your own part. You are an independent arm of the court. That is absolute and it's within control.
You have it's a problem of a misinformed judge. It is a common problem, like I pointed out before, and it's one of the issues of being here at a law school doing this program, because part of the beachhead here is to let the law school know, you guys don't know anything about grand juries, do you? And that's because none of the judges know anything about grand juries, and the DAs and the county councils don't know anything. They know, I shouldn't say anything, they don't know enough. And they should be more uniformly and comprehensively informed while they're in law school before they become officers of the court, because some of these officials, and we've had them very candid before us, and I'll read you some of this a little later in the vignettes from presentations of former judges that have said that, you know, I was the new judge, I got selected, and then they gave me the grand jury, and the first I did, what's a grand jury, you know? and really, they don't know, and so they end up winging it, or they turn to the other judge, well, what do I do? He says, oh, don't bother, the DA handles it, or some other thing. And so oftentimes the judges are as ill-informed as the jury, sad to say, and we hope as part of our existence as an association to get this information out and kind of try to do the best we can to guilt trip these law schools into at least providing a couple units of information about the civil, particularly the civil functions of the grand jury, because everyone knows about the criminal indictment function, but nobody knows anything about the civil function. And one other little modicum of information along that line is that from kindergarten to PhD, there is not a curriculum in the state of California in any university, high school, elementary school, I don't care what kind of school, that speaks anything about the civil function of the grand jury. You cannot find a paragraph about the grand jury civil functions or contributions to California's evolution of local government over the past 150 years. And I'll guarantee you that grand juries have contributed enormously to the grooming and refinement and sophistication of local government over the past century and a half. But they don't get the credit. And I think that young people need to know about this, and as well as everyone that studies civics, California history, and whatnot, because the grand juries do a lot of hard work. Look at this book, 5 years. There's hundreds of studies and reports and critiques of operations of government. Those have an effect. They're report cards on performance that go to the public, and those have an effect. If they give you credit or not, if they say you don't know what you're talking about or not, they have an effect. They know when you hit a soft spot, and when they squeak the loudest, means you probably hit a nerve that was really sensitive, and they're just trying to smoke screen it out because they don't want to admit that they weren't doing something as well as they could be. So you are doing your work, even though you generally don't get the appreciation and credit for it. So you need to have, let's see, where did I get off the track here? Complaint log. You need that complaint log. The complaint log is, okay, you get complaints. One of the methods by which grand juries determine part of their activity is to respond to complaints from the community regarding governmental agencies that are being, you know, overzealous in enforcement of some trivial rule, or you've got some officer that's being a real stinker, or somebody isn't performing a function in accordance with the way they're supposed to, or they're differentially providing a service to, you know, different socioeconomic groups, or whatever the complaint might be about. The grand jury should log those complaints in, because you receive a complaint at the beginning of your term. You don't know if that's the first time that department has ever had a complaint against it in the past 50 years, or if this is the 100th complaint that's been issued about that department in the past 6 months. You just got one. And so what is it? The tip of the iceberg or an isolated speck of dust? You don't know unless you have in your grand jury library a compilation of all of the complaints for the past 10 years. If you don't have that, then you should begin this year with your own complaint file and your own complaint log, so that not only you, but as time goes on, future grand juries are able to evaluate the nature and the chronic nature of complaints by that complaint log. You get a complaint about Department X, Is this just an innocent misunderstanding by somebody that just doesn't, that got something misinterpreted? Or is this the 50th time in 6 months that people have had a problem with this agency, but you only know about the one because you just came into service? Yes?
You said about checking, regarding the complaint law, checking the law library,
The
county library.
No, the grand jury library. If I say law library, I meant the grand jury library.
So that's a library that's sealed except for grand jurors.
The exclusive use of the grand jury. Nobody else. That means the DA, the county council, nobody else uses that law library without asking you. This is your law, your library. It's not just the law library. It also has your grand jury reports in it, your past responses. It could be manuals. It could be operational policy guidelines for various departmental operations from different agencies throughout the county. It could be a whole bunch of stuff that you're going to need on a regular basis in various investigations.
But this would be confidential.
Oh, absolutely. Strictly. Strictly. It's, it should be in a locked cabinet or something. But the log itself does not need to be, I don't think. This could be something that's more readily available to you. It's not giving any identifiers, no names of who's who. It's the tool for the grand jury to use to determine the chronic nature of certain types of complaints.
I wasn't thinking of the grand jury. I was thinking of county council or district attorney.
They have no access, not theirs. Not this is your document. That's why you need a dedicated, lockable space, belongs exclusively to the grand jury. Not a borrowed file cabinet in the DA's office, your own secured office with your own lockable file cabinet that only you and future grand juries have access to. Unless the judge wants to see it, you always let the judge have what he wants. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is carryover grand jury research files. Moving right along. You have a multiplicity of committees. Those committees work very hard. Maybe they don't. You know, there's no law preventing you from playing cards all year. But you will have a committee that, say, generates a big package of very useful information. It takes you maybe 3 or 4 months to gather this information together. Various documents, procedures, policy documents, audit reports, whatnot, about the functioning of a given agency. At the conclusion of your grand jury's year, your report is finished, yet here you have all this wonderful research material that you've gathered together. Do you round file it? I say no. I say, and many others have done so, is that you should take these documents, because these are documents that are very relevant to future studies. You should take these kinds of documents and compilations of research material and put them in a special file, particularly if the committee feels they're not everything. You don't save everything. Save stuff that's of substantive value for future potential investigations. And create an orderly file. Put a cover letter on it that explains what the file is about, why it's important to keep, what is in it, and who generated it, and maybe even to what report it was related to. And then put that in your file. And then put that file in the grand jury library index so that, say, 5 years from now, another grand jury comes along and here, good old Department X is on the board again for another investigation. And the grand jury looks in their grand jury library index and they find, hey, look, the 1994 grand jury has a information file on Department X. Let's check it out. And you go get that file out of the cabinet and you find that they've saved you 3 months of hard work gathering this material together. That's 3 months of time that you now have to dedicate to doing maybe even a more penetrating job of a similar sort of nature in delving even deeper into the nature of certain difficulties in that particular agency. It gives you an opportunity to spend that precious little time that you have more diligently working on finding even more information out, and you may find that as a result of your service you add a few more things to this file and it's even a better file. News clip files are also useful. Keeping news clip files, I would recommend that you put news clip files in your grand jury library as well, to get some notion of how the news treats your various grand jury reports. It gives you some sort of an insight as to how grand juries in the past might have missed the boat by failing to do certain things, and they might have issued a report and failed to, say, interview one very key official. Well, it kind of forewarns you to be a little bit more comprehensive and thorough with regards to your investigation and not make the same mistake that that grand jury did. Because as I pointed out before, when it comes to the news, they're going to look for the flaws, and the flaws are going to be what are in the bold print. And so you want to try to avert the pitfalls of former grand juries, and news clip files will kind of sensitize you to that. Now, grand jury training, there's 3 types. There's your local training and orientation program. Hopefully you have one. If you don't, you should make that a part of your grand jury study and recommend that you henceforth start having them. Regional training seminars are really good, and if your jury can afford them, you should certainly try to send as many of your jurors as possible to any regional experience that's available to you, because you can learn things in regional experiences you just can't get locally, because you're learning from people that are not officials in your own county, so they have no conflict of interest with regards to being fully disclosing or only partially disclosing information because of their concerns on what you might or might not do. And plus you also get the opportunity to mix it up with jurors from around the state and maybe get some ideas that you might not otherwise come across. And likewise, they'll get some ideas from you. So it's a great information, cross-pollination kind of an opportunity. If you need some training in an area that you haven't received the training and you recognize that need, nothing's preventing the grand jury from calling training into itself. You can decide, we need to know more about city government. How do city councils work? You can bring in whoever you can find, a local professor, a local high school teacher in civics. You can bring in officials from, say, a couple of different cities to give you a general informational orientation about city government. So you have that authority to bring information to yourself just on your own motion. It doesn't have to be brought to you by the officials in the county or by former grand jurors. One of the things under continuity in some of the counties I think are a little draconian in the way they go about not giving training to their grand jurors is that in recognition of this, part of the function of a continuity committee in my view is that you can prepare training yourself. You can at least try to cover some of the elements of training that you think were missed, that weren't given to you, that should be given to future grand juries. And if you have uncooperative local officials that feel that the former jurors should not have access to any kind of training, and they want to garner that training experience to themselves, as I know there are many counties that do that. Only the district attorney does the training, or only the county council does the training. If you feel a grand jury needs training, all you have to do as a committee is write a communication to the new grand jury saying, we as the continuity committee or the training committee of the former grand jury, in recognition of the need for a better orientation in certain elements of your service, are prepared to come in and provide you with a certain amount of orientation and whatnot, workshops regarding your grand jury service. And you can just sort of humbly offer it. And invariably the grand juries will be happy to invite you in, particularly in the early weeks of their service, when really they're just sort of getting used to things and deciding where they're going to sit in the room and whatnot. And finally, grand jury independence. My last little comment, I'll let you read these statutes I've listed. I would like to point out there's one more I would hope you would read, Penal Code 921, which says, and it's one of my favorite ones, the grand jury is entitled to free access at all reasonable times to the examination without charge of all public records within the county. That's all public records in the county, not some of the public records in the county, all the public records, not just the county records that the officials want to give you, all the records. So if you want those records, you have a right to get them. If they're not forthcoming, you have a right to demand them. If they're not forthcoming, you can subpoena them. You have the power to access to any of the records that you want, that you think you need to do a comprehensive, thorough job of your investigation. The grand jury, unlike any other body in the county, All other bodies are created for a very specific purpose. You have committees, commissions, various advisory panels focusing on homeless problems, child welfare problems, transportation, highways problems, general planning problems, all kinds of problems usually have blue ribbon panels focusing on a very specific, narrow topic. The grand jury can pick its topic. You have the independent freedom to choose of all of the possibilities which of the topics you are going to undertake. You are an independent body. You are the only ones that have the authority to make that decision. No one can tell you what to do or tell you that you can't do something, as long as you're within the law. So with that, we're out of time. A couple questions? Yes?
Can you do me one favor? I had a technical problem when you described the writ of mandamus.
Yeah?
Can you just briefly go over that?
Okay, writ of mandamus one more time. This is a document that can be filed by anybody. It can be just a lay citizen off the street. It can be a grand jury as a body, or it can be even a grand juror, preferably a former grand juror, because you wouldn't want one juror doing something without the support of the full jury. But it is a way to get an official who is not complying with a state statute to have the court order that official to comply with the state statute. So you file a writ of mandamus, and then the court is obliged to schedule a hearing, and then the judge reviews the statute and reviews the situation. If the official is not complying with a certain statute that he is obliged to comply with, the court will then order him, it will be obliged to order him to comply by a certain time. And it can be tomorrow, it can be Friday, it could be 30 days, whatever the judge thinks is reasonable. And then if the official fails to comply, he is then in contempt of the court, and sanctions can be held, such as a fine or a jail time, or both, for the contemptuous conduct. So it is another vehicle to use, particularly I bring it up in the case where you have officials that have chosen to disregard their responsibility to respond properly to the findings and recommendations of a grand jury report.